in districts of 2 sub-Saharan African countries finds that access to improved water is associated with women spending 2 hours less in a day on unpaid care and domestic work activities in Uganda and 4 hours less in Zimbabwe. At the same time, it's associated with women and children spending more time on leisure activities. And interestingly, it is also associated with higher productivity in the time that women spend on unpaid care and domestic work activities. So it's not just about reducing the hours that women spend on unpaid care and domestic work. And the study that Diane Perrins presented yesterday also showed that an investment of 2% of GDP into the caring industry would have a multiplier effect, creating over 21 million jobs, so double for women than for men. So how do we get there? And here we draw a lot from the recommendations of the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, wrapping up, as well as some of the recommendations put forward by Diane Nelson yesterday. So firstly, the need to integrate time use surveys, including supervision hours and existing labor force surveys that are conducted regularly. So Oxfam, through its Women's Economic Empowerment and Care Program, is working with the Ugandan Bureau of Statistics, among others, to include questions on care work in their demographic and health survey. But more importantly, though, it's about ensuring that the information that comes out of these surveys is used to inform policy design. So there are 85 countries already that have done some form of time use survey. We also need more research from a feminist economics perspective that explores the channels through which macroeconomic policies impact the full spectrum of women and men's work. We need to expand fiscal space, and that means that paying for these key investments in the public sector involves ensuring that the richest pay their fair share of taxes, as well as gender budgeting around the raising and actual spending of tax revenue. And importantly, we need to ensure that the interests of the most vulnerable women are brought into these political and decision-making bodies, to ensuring that information on the one hand is readily available, but also enhancing their capacity to engage with macroeconomic policies. Several organizations like Oxfam and Dawn are investing in capacity building for women's rights organization. We also need to bring together researchers like the Women's Budget Group and the new evidence that they generate, connected better with activists and other key stakeholders. And as well as outsider strategies, we need insider strategies, so training MPs and government officials to understand these new pieces of evidence. I'm concluding. So as the high-level panel proposed, and we've been saying, we need to develop broad alliances with new stakeholders while strengthening existing multi-stakeholder partnerships to better understand those structural issues which are critical in order to speed up progress on women's economic empowerment, while expanding the definition of that to include increased power, expanded choice, and for the high contribution of women's work in the labor force to have more paid hours in decent work and fewer unpaid hours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Talia and Anna. That was a really comprehensive overview which built beautifully on the contributions of the 2 Dianes yesterday, and systematically identified a lot of policy activity. Now, we have under 5 minutes. We started a little bit late, but if we're not to have our tea break late, we have less than 5 minutes. So could we take a round of questions, please? Who would like to ask? Yes.
Thanks, that's brilliant. And I think the work that Oxfam is doing on this is really quite groundbreaking. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot in the last day or so is about social norms and how we go about tackling social norms. And there always seems to be a sense of paralysis when we start talking about social norms. There is a sense that somehow there's something really big here that's really difficult to shift, and we've thought about stickiness and or the sense that we can do everything right and yet still everything remains the same. So I wondered whether you could maybe talk a little bit about how we've translated the understanding of social norms into quite practical strategies to address them, because I think there is something around that about including politics, including collective action, including a sense of outrage about what's happening here, that makes this sense of how we tackle social norms kind of just push a little bit beyond that sense of paralysis.
Should we answer that, or
Are there any other questions? That was quite a big one.
I can start with a question. Unfortunately, warfare brings great changes in women's participation in paid work. And I want to ask a question about Rosie the Riveter and the period in which in many societies women went into manufacturing work, transport, administrative work, a whole range of things that traditionally they had been excluded from. And then the lack of consolidation and continuation after warfare emergency conditions ended. And what we can learn from historical examples of this sort as to how not only to initiate but to consolidate, to continue progress.
Okay, those are mighty questions.
should I take this?
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm not quite sure what you're aiming at on the social norms piece, but I guess just to say that what we've found is that it's very important to do context-specific research about what women and men think, both descriptive and norm and injunctive norms in certain districts, rather than these global ones or even national level. And then we've also worked with people who do communications and marketing and advertising to say, okay, let's be very rigorous about this and try to test certain different messages and images, what works, doing the kind of consumer testing. So we're trying to bring together the best of the private sector with the academic or the NGO type of work. Sometimes this gets difficult because because the advertisers want to make it very simplistic. When actually it is a complex issue. But we found that doing the social norms work in a very rigorous way is really helpful. I don't know much about post-war Rosie the Riveter.
I just want to tell you something about that. The Rosie the Riveter thing is really interesting because
maybe not everybody knows what Rosie the Riveter is.
So Rosie the Riveter was a very popular female icon of women going into, actually it was the automotive factories, wasn't it, in the States, to take over men's jobs during the Second World War. And the interesting thing is, from some studies in labour studies, is that the way they did that was to market it as a very feminised job. So the idea of that work was presented as feminised, so it sort of pulled lots of strings about what women are good at and why they would be good in this factory. And then when the war ended, it was sort of rolled back, and there's a lot of really, really interesting literature around this about what happens there and the role of trade unions in that as well. So yeah,
what it brings to mind is that there are many cases where, on the reverse, men do care work, but only when they have to. So which is the parallel with Rosie the Riveter. And so that so if Filipino women are migrating for jobs elsewhere, then men are raising the families or something like that. But it seems to me that what needs to happen is not just they can do it, but they should do it, and and it's beneficial for society. I mean, there's a lot of the injunctive, but it's also true that sometimes it's not that you have norms change and then behavior change, but sometimes you have behavior change and then norms change. And so what we found often is that if you do have campaigns to teach boys cooking or something like that, and boys are actually cooking, then eventually it becomes that, oh yes, boys do cook. But what we're doing often is to not look at the most sticky places, but to look at the opportunities where things are already changing and try to push those along.
Thank you. We now only have time for half an hour for the other two speakers. Devki, do you want to?
Not just a comment. I think this was very interesting that you every time end with the fact that macroeconomic policies have to be changed for us to get where we want to go. This headline, if we all agree, is one of the headlines which we can have all these activism and research and so on, but that is crucial to making our journey a little less obstructed. So I just wanted to comment that at least 5 slides said macroeconomic policies.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. The conversation has started. There's maybe not such a big break between the first presentation and the second one. Is by Tom Schuler, who's chair of the governing body of the Working Men's College and has had a life in education, in lifelong learning, and in research on the life course and the paradox between achievement and earnings. And he is going to talk about inequalities between education and work and revisiting his Paula principle. Over to you.
Thank you very much.
Half an hour totally.
Right. No, I'll try and make it in 20 minutes max.
It's a question of the ratio between your presentation and then the discussion.
Answer. I'm going to start with what marketing people tell you shouldn't do, which is all the negatives. I'm not an economist. I'm not a gender specialist. I don't know much about development. And I'm going to take rather a narrower view, certainly, than the last one. But I hope there'll be some good complementarity between the two. I call this the dynamics of inequalities, because actually what the Paula principle is about is 2 trends and the relationship between the changes going on. And it's that changing relationship between those 2 trends that forms the basis of what I'm going to talk about.